genetic variation. Absolutely right. So what happens with that genetic variation?
It has to give them some kind of advantage in the environment.
Hmm? Yeah. So what's the consequence of that advantage in the environment?
Higher survival for that type of business.
Yeah, great. So you might remember this is Charles Darwin's big idea. So here's the definition that I like. So it's the process by which heritable traits, so we now know that heritable traits are encoded by DNA in the organism's genome, become more or less common in a population of organisms based on the reproductive success of organisms with those traits. So then, as Jeff was saying, what we need to have for natural selection are three things. So we have to have genetic variation. So if you remember the toothpick lab, which we did quite a while ago, you went out and put different colors of toothpicks in the grass, and some were much easier to find than others. So those would have been at a disadvantage because they were being eaten by birds. But if all the toothpicks were the same color, you'd be able to pick them up with the same frequency, right? So there wouldn't be any selection there. So you have to have genetic variation. You need to have an excess of offspring. So this just gets at the idea that organisms are competing with each other, right? So if there are way more resources, food say, than the population of organisms needs to survive and reproduce, then it's not really going to matter too much what their genetics are, because they're all going to have enough food and enough mates. But if there are more of them around than there is available food or mates, then they're going to have to compete with each other. So then the last requirement is going to be differential fitness. So that means that organisms that have certain genes, if we think about the toothpick example, the ones that were the same color as the grass, those had an advantage because you couldn't see them as well and eat them, right? So these are the three requirements for natural selection. So the reason I'm talking about this in the context of biotechnology is to lead into the earliest form of human biotechnology, which is crop domestication. So all the food that we eat is all derived from organisms that evolved naturally in their environments, but we've modified almost all of them pretty extensively. So a good example is corn. And so corn was bred by humans from the wild relative, which is on the left here, which is teosinte. And so this is native to the highlands in Mexico. So you can see it looks kind of similar to modern corn, but there's some pretty big differences. So you can see how it's highly branched. And then also the seeds are much, much smaller. So teosinte evolved in its environment because these characteristics were favorable for its reproduction. So this is a really great example of that. So on the left-hand side of the picture here, I've got modern corn seeds. They're real big, they're bright yellow. If I was a bird or a squirrel or something, that'd be pretty easy to find and eat. But on the right-hand side, these little dark things that look like pebbles, those are actually teosinte seeds. So they're really hard to see, and they have this kind of stony, hard exterior that make them difficult to eat. Then if we look back at the plant here, we can see there's not much of a cob. And so once this kind of dries out, it'll shatter, so the seeds will just fly off and go all over the place, which makes sense. You want to distribute the seeds so that each of the seeds has as good of a chance of finding a favorable place to grow. so what the ancient Mexican farmers did was they found natural variants growing in the wild that had genes that changed some of these teosinte characteristics to characteristics that were favorable for agriculture. So this process is called artificial selection. So it's very similar to natural selection, except for it's not the environment that's deciding which offspring are more fit, it's us. So the ancient Mexicans who are looking at corn, they thought it would be great if the corn was all attached to a single ear. So when they found a natural mutant that did that, they kept it and planted its offspring. Corn that's not all branched all over the place and it's just a single stalk is much easier to grow in a farm field. So they also selected a mutation for that. So the more common word that we use to talk about artificial selection is breeding. And so on the right is one of the genes that was selected for thousands of years ago. So this is the TGA1 gene. So on the left, we have kind of a normal teosinte ear of corn. And then if you change just one nucleotide in this TGA gene, this is what happens. So the stony, hard exterior is gone. So now the seeds are easier to eat. And we've got a bit of a cob forming. So this is one of the variants that was selected for. And in addition to some of those things, there are also what are called, I won't get into the name, but there are sort of more variable traits that you can select for generation after generation. And a good example of that is cob size. And so when you just have that one mutation in the TGA gene, you can see the ear is pretty small, right? It doesn't look anything like a nice, big, healthy, modern corn ear. But over the course of many, many generations, these farmers were selecting the biggest ears in their field. So they had different genes. They didn't know what the genes were. They didn't even know about DNA, right? But they were able to select for ones that were bigger and therefore easier to work with. So this is what they were able to do over hundreds of generations. And so you can do this for a lot of different traits. So this is an experiment from the University of Illinois, which is where I went to school, so I figured I'd put it up there. So this is actually one of the longest running biological experiments in the world. So this has been going on since 1896. So that's over here on the left. And so what this top line is that each generation, they looked at the corn kernels and selected the ones that had the most protein. So they've been doing that every year for the last 110 years or so, and they've been able to significantly increase the level of protein. So for some traits, you can kind of keep doing this from generation to generation, which is really pretty cool. All right, so time to put on your plant breeder hats. So what I want you guys to do is think about if you were developing plants for use in agriculture, what sort of traits might you want to select for? So take a minute to think about that.